Forager is a relatively new adventure and crafting game inspired by the greats such as Zelda, Terraria, and Stardew Valley. It has a cute art style that manages to be charming in spite of its simplicity, and is overall pleasant in its presentation. Unfortunately though, Forager's design fails to understand what makes the games that it was inspired by so great. It's a crafting game without the freedom of expression. It's an adventure game without a challenge or a compelling world to explore. And it's a farming game without goals and chores to truly invest in. I'm not going to sit here and tell you that Forager is outright a bad game, because it's not. I played it for about 14 hours and enjoyed my time with it. Things work well enough, and it's got an addicting gameplay loop that can keep your eyes glued to the screen for hours after you should have gone to bed. It scales to some chaotic extremes that can be relatively satisfying as your capabilities grow from barely being able to destroy a rock without exhausting yourself to raising the entire countryside in a matter of minutes with nothing but your sword and an army of drones by your side. But while I did have some fun, I can't really say that Forager ever gave me any particular feeling of accomplishment the way the other games in this genre do. Now, I don't normally like comparing small indie games to gigantic hits like the ones that I mentioned, but these titles are dropped by name in the game's description itself. But because I found myself so uniquely underwhelmed by the game by the time I had finished it, I'm going to be using these big names as convenient examples and comparisons to explore why Forager doesn't really work. Think of your favorite crafting-centric game. It could be Minecraft or Terraria, and it could even be 7 Days to Die or Ark. Ignoring the combat for a minute here, these games have something in common to their core of crafting: the ability to express yourself through creations. I'm not just speaking artistically here either. When you build your first crappy little house in Terraria, that house is an expression of your efficiency, your experience, your desires at the time, and your aesthetic tendencies. You made the house, and you had to work to build it brick by brick. This is your house, and it becomes your central hub throughout your time in the game. You constantly return to it to expand, store loot, power up, and recover as you progress through various technologies. The safety and storage and the attachment created by the work that you put in to create this home helps drive you forward and keeps you invested in the game. In contrast to that, though, Forager is very rigid? I don't know if that's the right word. But the closest thing to home that you have is the island that you start on, and that's only because it's the only place that you even have access to at the start of the game, and it just so happens to be at the center of the map that you slowly uncover as you get rich enough to buy your access to more and more islands. Anything you build, though, is no more exciting than plopping down a workbench in Terraria with none of the infrastructure around it to make the place interesting or worth hanging out in. It's just there because that's where you put it, nothing more. And on top of all that, the fact that literally everything just respawns around you at all times means that the only lasting impact that you have on your world are the buildings that you plop down to transform your resources from one thing to another. Forager lacks any meaningful way to shape your world to your vision, and its longevity greatly suffers for it. The sense of adventure and challenge in Forager leaves a lot to be desired as well. You'll be exploring your world in small, square-sized chunks, none any larger than your initial island. Each one will have an NPC with a quest, a dungeon, a puzzle, or a treasure to nab. Aside from that, the island that you just bought is just a little more land to exploit for more resources on your way up the tech tree. These little activities on each island become one of the prime reasons to want to buy them, because there's something slightly different to break up the chores, even if it just winds up being a boring fetch quest. Eventually, you'll discover that each side of the map contains a different biome, and eventually you'll discover a dungeon in that biome. Each of these dungeons is filled with enemies, and aside from the first dungeon, which is little more than a glorified maze, they're each filled with minor puzzles and locked doors that come between you and defeating the dungeon's boss. And when I say minor puzzles, I mean it. The Zelda series tends to get a lot of crap for its puzzles being very simple and thoughtless in their design, riding the line between tedium and intrigue, but most of Forager's puzzles, believe it or not, are even simpler than that. And the few that aren't simple are weirdly obtuse, such as this weird binary-based puzzle in the ice biome. Even after looking up the solution to this one, I still don't understand it. But as far as puzzles in games go, Foragers honestly weren't that bad in spite of my complaints. They were a welcome distraction to break up the monotony of endless gathering and crafting, but a break in the repetition isn't the only ingredient for a satisfying adventure. The player needs to feel like they really went somewhere. Perhaps it's the simplistic art style of Forager, but nothing I ever did within the game felt like I was actually accomplishing anything or going somewhere dangerous. There's no story or stakes to tie the NPCs or the world or even the dungeons together. You get seals to prove that you conquered each dungeon, but they don't amount to anything other than another stamp in your collection book. You defeat bosses in the dungeons, but you don't get the impression that they were threatening anything or anyone. You just invaded their home and smited them down because you're a god of your domain for no particular reason. And none of the NPCs in the world even feel like they belong in the space that they inhabit. They're just quest dispensaries. They don't move, they don't really do anything other than give you your one quest, and then they don't do anything else, ever. I guess they have a few lines after that, but who cares? But any sense of adventure here winds up being a brief trick to break up the monotony of just collecting more things, and by the end, you don't really feel like you really did anything. And that neatly ties into the final big game that was name-dropped by Forager's description page, Stardew Valley. Stardew Valley is a game about goals, more or less. The game is constantly presenting you with something just out of your reach, and you need to put in the work to get there. Once you do, you're often presented with a new goal, again, just outside your reach. Each goal you accomplish feels significant and meaningful for a few reasons. First, it takes a conscious effort to save up or otherwise push for these minor goals. It's on your mind through each in-game day, which is the second reason. The time crunch in each day forces you to try and make efficient decisions to drive you towards that goal. And third, most of these goals not only increase your productivity, but they also leave some sort of impact on the world. Whether it's upgrading your house or impregnating your wife, you get clear proof of what you've done. The only one of these things that Forager is really able to claim is the way it presents you with goals on your quest towards the end of the game. You could be aiming for a specific node on the skill grid, or a new building you just unlocked, or even a tool upgrade, but other than the minor victory of upgrading your sword or something, it feels like a hollow acquisition. It's hard for me to really pinpoint why it feels this way, but I think it comes down to a lack of any real consequence of the few choices that Forager presents to you. The lack of consequence encompasses a few things here. It's very hard to die, for one, and even if you do, you lose a few minutes of progress tops. Inventory management is barely an issue in the early game and goes away completely once you unlock storage vaults. This is especially forgiving, seeing as there are no stack limits for anything in your inventory, letting you carry around enough stone to build Mount Rushmore brick by boring brick if you really wanted to. And finally, there are no time limits imposed upon you, which means that you're not forced to prioritize anything over anything else. You can do whatever you want in Forager with full confidence, knowing that you'll be able to get around to that other thing eventually, and nothing's stopping you like those pesky seasons or stamina. Well, I guess stamina can slow you down, but hey, just eat a few of those few thousand berries in your bag and you'll be okay. It wasn't until I watched Joseph Anderson's video on this game that I realized just how much Forager feels like an idle game in its gameplay. The lack of depth, the mindless and repetitive clicking tasks, the slow erosion of your need to manually collect things in the game, and the consistent drip of dopamine as every minor goal pushes you towards your next. It's all there, but that's part of the problem, isn't it? Idle games aren't terribly engaging, but that's part of the point of them. The more interaction it requires for the low depth that is offered, the less satisfying it becomes. And while Forager for sure isn't an idle game, it feels enough like one at many points that you can't help but ask, but what did I really do? Like I said at the top of the video, I don't think that Forager is a bad game. It really feels like it was made with good intentions by a developer without a lot of experience under his belt, and I'd like this critique to be taken with good intentions too. It's been a long time since I felt so compelled to finish a game just to feel as completely unsatisfied by the experience as Forager left me. So I wanted to explore why that was. The game's Steam page itself really doesn't do the game any favors either, and I think that really needs to be addressed. My direct comparisons to Terraria, Stardew Valley, and Zelda may not be fair, but they're only here because they're on the Steam page, and while I certainly don't think it's a crime by any means to be inspired by your favorite games, I find it very misleading to drop names this powerful in the first line of your description, especially followed by a list of game features that are not nearly as in-depth as the wording of them seems to imply. And at $20, Forager's not a game that I can even recommend to anybody if it doesn't receive some significant updates or some significant changes. I would have expected to pay like $10 tops for something as shallow as this that has little to no replay value. But as usual with pricing games, your mileage may vary here. Unfortunately, Forager is more addicting than it is fun, and that's ultimately what's so disappointing about it. It lacks any sort of context or depth that makes its peers worth playing and coming back to time and time again. But from what I can tell from the developer's self-insertion into this game and his presence on Steam, Forager was made with passion. I only hope that this passion is enough to help this game become something greater than it is today, and give me a compelling reason to come back and play it again in the future. Thanks for watching.